Illustrator really provides us with the best interface for drawing splines for our motion graphics, and I recommend using it a lot in your pipeline in terms of being able to draw splines in a good interface that are easy to manipulate. So last time we talked about drawing splines, and this time not only is it crucial that you draw good splines and get really handy with the pen tool, but I argue it's also important that you get really good with organizing your project and understanding strategically how your project's going to come together in After Effects. So part of this pipeline is exporting your splines out of Adobe Illustrator, and really you're not exporting them, you're saving them to the Illustrator's native format, and then you're importing that into After Effects. And if we do it properly, it comes in a really easy to manage format, but you have to follow the rules properly and you have to organize properly up front. And after you do this a couple of times and you work through this process a couple of times, it just becomes second nature. And the nice part is that you start out really organized instead of learning this the wrong way and then having to correct yourself. So what we have here is we have a couple of splines that I've drawn. Some of them are from other projects. And I just wanted to generate a couple of pieces that would show maybe a variety of something that might come into a fun narrative, right? So we've got some mountains here that I drew, lots of corner handles, right? And then we've got, cityscape, lots of corner handles as well. Really simplified, right? So we're not, we're representing things. You can understand what these are. Representational graphics that are just really abstract and representational sometimes make the point better than something that you've slaved over for hours and hours and hours. So just keep that in mind. And also here, something that was a little bit more difficult to do was tracing over a plane. But obviously, I probably did this from an image. It's been a while since I did it, but you've noticed that we've got lots of handles in here. We've got corner handles, we've got curve handles, and they all come together to make a recognizable shape. It's pretty easy to understand that this is a plane. And of course we've got a speech bubble too, which I thought would be fun to throw in as part of our narrative. So our next step really is, now we've got splines, we want to take these splines and we want to get them organized so that Adobe After Effects can really read them in a manner that are easy to manipulate. So is coloring important? Yeah, coloring, you can color them the way that you want in Illustrator. You can always recolor them in After Effects. So if you make a mistake here, it's not a big deal. But the nice part is that you can always go back to this file. Once it's linked into Adobe After Effects, you can go into this file and tweak a couple of things. If you wanted to tweak the color, the stroke thickness, stuff like that, you can tweak those factors in here, save it out, reload into After Effects without having to import the whole thing, but just lightly reload it, and it'll show those changes. So that's all part of setting up a really solid pipeline so that when clients change their mind, when you change your mind, things aren't completely disastrous. So we're going to take a look at this. Is my positioning important? Not entirely, because we're going to be doing a large majority of that manipulation in After Effects anyway. So I'm going to be, the sizing and the proportion of these elements is likely going to change when we get this stuff into After Effects. But it'll make it really easy, now that we kind of understand the components here and we've laid them out nicely in Illustrator, I can import them into After Effects and manipulate them appropriately. So I like to just create a nice, clean, neat layout for myself. It's really up to you how you want to do this, but this is how I like to do it, and it usually brings me a good deal of success doing it this way. So in order to keep things organized, the next thing that we really need to look at is the layer panel. So when you first open up Adobe Illustrator, you may have any number of configurations that get pulled down. And you may have any number of panels on the side here. It's not necessarily going to look, your panels are not necessarily going to look like mine. This is what I usually use, and this is what my configuration has been over time. So what we are going to do, though, is we are going to work in this. It's called the Layers panel. Most of you should have it. I think it comes down by default. But if you can't find your Layers panel, it looks like these two diamonds on top of one another. And when you click on it, you get something that looks a little bit like this. Make sure you go up to Windows and you go to find the Layers panel. So over the course of things, when I refer to panels and the panels are missing, the first thing you should do is go to this Windows menu and find them. And there's all different kinds of panels underneath here that are really useful. I really like the Pathfinder panel. There's any number of things. The gradient panel is really useful. So there's all different kinds of panels underneath here that you'll use if you get really heavily into Illustrator. But the thing to remember is if you can't find it, look under here. And make sure you pull it down from here if you don't have it. So I go back here and I can pull out my Layers panel and look at it. If you've used Photoshop, This looks somewhat familiar if you're used to working with layers in Photoshop. So what we have here is Illustrator, just like Photoshop, has layers. But the different thing is that layers also have paths or different objects nested underneath of them. And you'll notice here that each one of these is a particular path inside of a single layer. Well, this is interesting because if we want to get this, if we want to get a solid workflow set up and get this put into After Effects, then what After Effects is going to see when we import this file and we import it as a composition, it's just going to see it this way. The problem that presents is that all 4 of these objects here are going to be stuck on one layer. And really, in After Effects, you manipulate on a layer by layer, in a layer by layer fashion. So the problem here is that all 4 of these objects are going to be on a single layer, and we're not going to be able to tweak them separately, which is really what we want to do. That's going to be conducive to us telling our story, right? So I'm going to go through here and I'll show you. I've got these 4 different objects, but they all show up on that one layer. So what we really want to do is we want to be able to separate these paths out and give them their own layer. Hey, you know what? You could do that manually if you want by going in here and adding layers into your layer panel and grabbing these and tweaking and pulling them up and doing it that way, right? You could do it that way. But what if you've got 100 different layers, which is not unusual, or 25 different layers, or any number of layers that is going to take you forever to organize? Well, it's fairly, there's a fairly simple way to do this. All you need to do is select your layer, and really you're going to pull down from this panel options menu. There's this option to release the layers sequence. And you'll probably come back to this one location in this video to look at this because it's a pretty obscure thing, but it's a tremendous time saver. So you'll be going, what was that one option? Well, the option is release the layers sequence. Don't get it confused with build. Use release the layers sequence. Now, if I click that, you'll notice it makes a layer for each one of the objects that's underneath of this one layer here. Well, this is interesting because I definitely want to keep these layers here. These are the layers that I want on the top. So I'm going to grab those. I'll shift select them all, right, from here. And then what I can do is I can take them and drag them up in the hierarchy, right? So what I've done is I've added them to the top level. And really, Adobe Illustrator is only going to see these at the top level. So I'm going to grab them and pull them and drag them to the top level so that I have them up here. And I've got these layers here that are empty. I can go ahead and I can delete them, not unlike what you could do in Photoshop. So now we've got this properly organized. If you have, like I said, if you've got 100 layers, 25 layers, you're going to notice that this is going to look a little bit longer, but you're going to be much more grateful for the fact that you can just do a single command to release it to layers as a sequence. So this is really ready. It's prepped. It's ready to go into Adobe Illustrator. Something to note about this layers panel here is that yours might look a little bit different. I have tweaked it a little bit so that it's easily visible on this video, but I've done it under panel options. So if yours looks a little different than mine, don't be concerned or alarmed by that. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to save this out as an Illustrator file, an Adobe Illustrator native file. So right now it already has a name, but what I like to do as a practice is after I get this all set up and working the right way and organized the way I want it, I usually will say, I'll usually give it the extension AE ready, which means that I can import this into After Effects and it's going to have all the layers in the right place and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save that. And it's going to give me this Illustrator box. That's fine. CS6 is fine because that's what we're working in. I'm going to press OK. So it's going to go ahead and it's going to save this out as an Illustrator file. So we're going to go over to the other side now into Adobe After Effects, and we're going to pull this up and import it the appropriate way so that we can see and manipulate all those layers. So I've gone ahead and I've opened up Adobe After Effects. And inside of After Effects, this may be the first time that some of you are seeing the inside of After Effects. Your panels may look a little bit different than mine. I typically darken my panels up a little bit so they're a little bit easier on the eyes. So if your panels are a little lighter, don't panic. Again, some of these things are customized portions on my part, so your interfaces may look slightly different, but nonetheless, there's really panels in here that are really important, and they span pretty much any interface that people work in After Effects. We've got the projects panel, the composition panel, and importantly, we've also got a timeline. We also use preview pretty heavily up here. I've got characters and things like this up here for typography and manipulation. It's really good to have that at hand, but not necessary. And underneath it here, the effects and presets box is really important for pulling down effects, and info is important as well. So there's a couple things in here that are pretty universal and you use them all the time. And effects controls usually hides out back behind projects, and that's strategically done. And we also have something called the render queue, which we can talk about later. Nonetheless, this is a little bit of an intro to the interface. And this is important. The thing that we're going to be concentrating on for this exercise here is the projects panel. So if I right click in the projects panel, it allows me to import something. I can import video footage, I can import graphics, I can import a Photoshop sequence, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the important thing to understand here is that you can import a file and have it be your Adobe Illustrator file. Remember that Illustrator file that we made earlier that had my plane and my speech bubble and things like that? Well, now we can go ahead and we can select it. We can go ahead and find it on our hard drive or wherever it is, import it with the import option, but we would use composition and we want to retain the layer sizes. You could do different things. If you import it as composition, then it's going to just come in as a single layer, which was the problem that we were talking about before, where if it all comes in as a single layer, then, well, it's not going to be quite as, you're not going to be able to manipulate quite as much about it. Sometimes you want to do this, but for the purposes of what we're trying to do, where we've got a couple of shapes and we want to move them and work with them, but we were able to draw them in the comfort of Illustrator, right now we want to bring them in as a composition. Now you can do composition and you can bring them in as a composition, but the problem with that is that the center of the composition as a whole is going to be the center of all the objects, and I won't get into big details about that until we start talking about motion. But nonetheless, composition retain layer sizes is a really important thing, and that's what we'll pull down. Composition retain layer sizes, and usually we get prompted to select this option again if need be. So I'm going to go ahead and open it, and it looks like I didn't get prompted to do it again, but sometimes if you import something and you seem a little unsure about it, it does prompt you again. Do you want to import it as a composition? Well, notice we get two things here in our bin, and if you're used to nonlinear editing, this is similar to a bin. It serves a little bit of a different purpose, but it's similar to a bin in, say, Adobe Premiere or Final Cut. We've noticed that we've pulled this folder in, right? And this folder contains all of our layers, right? So if we look here, we get a little bit of a preview. We've got our jet, we've got our mountains, we've got our cityscape. That's cool. What this is actually called a composition. And a composition it's a single timeline that we have where we can change keyframe things, we can do all sorts of things, and this is really what happens. This is the thing that you eventually will export as your MP4 file or your frame sequence or anything, and this is really the medium in which you work in is the composition, right? So it's similar to a sequence if you're used to Final Cut or if you're used to Adobe Premiere. So anyhow, it's already been nice enough to create a composition for us, which is nice. If I double click on that, it's going to load it into my timeline, but it's also going to load it in here in the composition, into the composition window. And you can go ahead and you can resize this however you want. I like to set it on fit, but you can set it on 25%. 25% is good for the resolution that we're at. And this is not unlike what we saw in Illustrator. It's just got a black background. So I think we're in good shape. And you'll notice down here you've got your layers, right? And each layer you can select it and call it out, and you can manipulate different things about it, right? So if I wanted to take this layer here, I can take it and I can move it around, right? I can manipulate the position of that. I can do all sorts of different things. I can rotate it, and we'll talk about this in another lesson here. But I can take this, I can rotate it, and I can scale it, right? So, but the nice part is this anchor point for the object is right in the middle, which is something we're afforded with the settings that we've picked. So that's the nice part about this. Also worth noting is that you can take these and you can organize them in different orders, and you can also change the names of them. So if I select that and I press the enter key or the return key, I can change that to cityscape or anything. Sometimes it helps to go through here and label these just so you know what's going on, right? So something else to consider too if you want to stay a little bit more organized.